Now we're picking up video 2 for our 10-22, 10-23 weekend. Alright, so we discussed William Lloyd Garrison in the Liberty Party. Sorry if I have like a weird thing in my mouth. I have like a sore on the side of my tongue. It's making me, it's more I talk, the more it hurts, so it's just, I apologize. Alright, black abolitionists. So, escaped slaves and free blacks were the ones who, they hit up north, and these are the ones a lot of times become part of the abolitionist movement, who want to promote the end of slavery and so on. The most famous of which is Frederick Douglass, who you read this week in the documents, who was a former slave and broke off. He taught himself to learn how to read, becomes very educated, very smart, speaks out against slave brutality and the degradation of slavery. Because again, if you don't ever see slaves, if you're from the North, you never experience slavery, what it's like, if you never see the realities of it, you don't know. And so these people who are ex-slaves, they can come up there, they can give these speeches, and they kind of reveal the realities of what slavery was and how it was bad and so forth. In 1847, he starts his own anti-slavery journal called the North Star, which you may have heard of before or read before. So he creates his own anti-slavery journal called the North Star. Other black abolitionists who were also prominent at the time were Harriet Tubman, David Ruggles, Sojourner Truth, and William Still. And you can see a few of these guys, like here's Frederick Douglass right here, you see Ruggles right here, and William Still, and you see Sojourner Truth all right here too. These black abolitionists helped to organize the effort to assist fugitive slaves head up north or to Canada as well. So not only are they promoting abolition and going against slavery in their speeches, but they're also helping any freed slaves make their way up into northern territories or into Canada to escape away from slavery. All right, one big event that happens this time period that's going to be very dramatic and changes towards slavery and abolition is the Nat Turner Revolt in 1831. In fact, there's a movie out about this right now in theaters called Birth of a Nation, which is about Nat Turner's revolt, which is supposed to be a pretty good movie. I haven't seen it yet, but if you want to go check it out. So in 1831, this is like the slave revolt. This is like the biggest slave revolt in America's history that a lot of people know about and has a profound effect on slavery in the South and so forth. So a Virginia slave, Nat Turner, led a revolt where he gets together a whole lot of other slaves together, and they kill about 55 whites in Virginia. So they get together this giant revolt, and they go through and they kill about 55 whites in this revolt in 1831. In retaliation, whites kill thousands of blacks in brutal fashion. So as a direct result of his rebellion, they of course are stopped, they're seized, and their rebellion is put down as a result. There had been some anti-slavery sentiment in the South before this, and discussion in the South before all this. Once Nat Turner hits, this basically ends any kind of anti-slavery talks in the South. So Nat Turner happens at the same time as abolition is happening. So as abolition is getting stronger, people in the South become more defensive of slavery. And once Nat Turner happens and whites in the South see what slaves can do, if getting a little bit of power, any talk of being anti-slavery or abolitionists in the South pretty much stops. And so going forward after Nat Turner in the 1830s up to the 1860s, the South is becoming more increasingly defensive of slavery and doesn't want to see it go away. And they're going to use whatever justifications they have to justify slavery's existence. So Nat Turner has, and of course when you talk about slave laws and slave codes, same thing happens before, right? They get stronger, they get weaker. It's got to be stronger, right? So as a direct result, they also get stronger. Slave restrictions also get stronger because they don't want taking chances of slaves getting together to revolt. And this is an image from the Nat Turner Revolt here, cartoon drawn in 1830s. Okay. So this is actually, I think it's our last slide. No, not quite. But this is going to be our talking towards our last slide and our last topics, wrapping up the South. This is chapter 16 material. We'll be wrapping this up on Monday. So let's get into it. So we're going to first kind of talk about the South in general before we get into the agriculture and everything else. So reform had little impact in many areas of the South. A lot of it because of the way it's set up, because it's still rural, because it's still farming. So the reform movements have very little impact in Southern states. Southerners are more committed to tradition. As we know, Southerners are big into tradition, and so do not accept or really embrace a lot of the reforms that are happening up north. They're very slow to accept public education and also humanitarian reforms like public institutions and mental asylums and mental hospitals. So the North's doing a lot of those things, but you don't really see that happening in the South because of the way we're structured and the way that we've always kind of been. A lot of Southerners are alarmed by Northerners joining forces with anti-slavery causes. So as the 1830s goes on, 40s and 50s, more and more Southerners are starting to distrust the North because they're joining these anti-slavery movements, whether it be complete abolition or just even stopping slavery expansion. It makes the South more and more protective of their way of life, their traditions, and slavery as an institution. Southerners viewed the Northern reform as a conspiracy against the Southern way of life. So the South also sees this reform movement as a conspiracy, especially with abolition too, which makes them more paranoid, more worried, which is why you have things like the nullification of tariff in the 1830s and why we're heading towards a civil war like we are, because the South's getting more and more paranoid about what might happen to their way of life, especially the elitists in the South too, who run the South. All right, so in the South, agriculture and especially cotton is king. Agriculture was the foundation of the South's economy. Small factories in the South only produce about 15% of the U.S. manufactured goods by the 1850s. So there are some factories in the South, maybe like in New Orleans, maybe like in Atlanta, but not a whole lot at all. So only 15% of America's manufacturing existed in the South by 1850s, which might be important for the Civil War later on. Hint, hint, right? Okay. So tobacco, rice, and sugar were big cash crops in the 1700s, and they still remain pretty big cash crops into the 1800s. But once cotton comes along and you have the cotton gin come along, cotton becomes the dominant crop growing in the South as a result. As we expand throughout the South, cotton becomes only bigger and bigger, and slavery only becomes bigger and bigger too. So cotton becomes the cash crop. It was the South's chief economic activity by the 1850s. That's why it was called, at the time, King Cotton. You can see some imagery I have here. I have a plantation, slaves working in the field on a cotton farm, also slaves working in general here too. And you'll see this slide again on Monday. We're actually going to go to that plantation. That's the one in St. Francisville. But you also kind of get this illustration of what slavery, a farm might look like back in those days too. All right, so anyway. So cotton was king. Textile mills and the cotton gin made cotton cloth more affordable throughout the world. So textile mills mostly located up north, like in New England, but the cotton gin was used heavily in the South. So between the textile mills up in New England and the cotton gin as well, cotton becomes extremely profitable. And we made so much cloth that we actually sold it internationally too. So not only was it a big hit in America, we also sold it to other countries, especially Great Britain. By 1860, Great Britain chiefly depended upon the U.S. for cotton. So Britain bought most of its cotton from the South, from the United States, and so the South became closely tied into the Great Britain, which is one of the reasons why they feel so confident it can break away come Civil War time, because it felt like, well, we have other countries who back us up on this. The countries that had heavy slave and heavy cotton production were South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, all the deep South. It's deep South that does cotton. So, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, those four for sure. Texas does it. South Carolina does it. Like, the ones that are more up north, like Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, even Virginia, those are a little bit different because they have different types of environments and so forth. New land was constantly needed to yield large profits because cotton can be very hurtful to the soil. Cotton, as a crop, can do a whole lot of damage and a whole lot of soil butchery if you don't take care of the land correctly. So to make a lot of money off of cotton, you had to have a lot of land, but at the same time, they kept using this land. They had to keep finding more land to keep cotton very profitable, too. By the 1850s, cotton provided 2/3 of all U.S. exports. Not agriculture, 2/3 of exports, period. So cotton was our main export of America by the 1850s. 2/3 of our exports was cotton. And this helped connect extremely well Great Britain and the South to one another because, again, Great Britain was the textile king country, and they bought our cotton, and so they made tons of textiles out of our cotton that we provided for them. So cotton was king, and that's why you have so many plantations. Every plantation pretty much from here in St. Francisville area up until Natchez, all cotton, right? There was cotton growing up in St. Francisville in those areas back in those days, around here too. That was the main crop. I mean, you have sugar cane like you have across the west side of the river, but that was not the big cash crop here. It was cotton. And if you go up north Louisiana, you can still see a lot of cotton fields. Just not a lot around here, but there are some up north. Okay, so we're going to get to slavery some. I'm just going to kind of touch on it because this is something I want to talk about, and this is one I want to kind of do some document discussion with on Monday. So let's talk briefly about slavery. I'll kind of do some introduction stuff on it, and then we'll kind of move on from there and wrap this up. So wealth in the South was measured in land and slaves. I mean, the people who ran the South, the elites, they were the large aristocracy. They owned lots of land, plantation owners, and they had lots of slaves, more than 100 typically. So if you're an elitist in the South, you're going to have a lot of land, hundreds of acres, and then also over 100 slaves. Slaves were treated as property subject to buying and selling. So, white men who bought and sold slaves thought of them as property. I've looked at slave auction books. I've looked at slave receipt books. It's kind of odd whenever you look at a value of certain people. If you're a young, strong black male, you're obviously worth a whole lot more than like an older black male or older black woman. Children are obviously cheaper than a older person would be. So it's they were seen as property, but it was also an investment too. And this is one of the things that kind of gets lost a lot of times in some of the media, movies, and things you see, that while there was slave abuse, masters wouldn't necessarily just want to beat on a slave or hurt a slave or break their arm or whatever because, and we mentioned this in class, because it's an investment, right? It's if your TV breaks, you don't just sit there and go punch it. As cruel as it sounds, but the idea is that you have to take care of them. So if they got sick, you want to get them better or get them healed up. That way they can keep being a worker for you. So that was the way they were saw. But the downside of this too is obviously that they are seen as property, so they're seen as less than being human. Also, if they have kids, they sell them off, or they split husbands and wives apart too, which is very common because you don't want to see close family ties in a plantation. That way they could one day try to rebel. So it became very normal for families to be split apart over time. So Southern whites did consider them to be human beings, just less than. So Southern whites did consider Africans to be human beings, just not the same as whites. Not as intelligent, not as capable as whites. And since whites also began to defend slavery, they called slavery the peculiar institution. That's a name that I have on here, but they called slavery the peculiar institution. Because it was this, it's a system they felt necessary to the South's economy. While they also saw these people as humans, they didn't know a way around it. And so it became this peculiar institution where they just didn't know really what to do else besides it. So they kind of got caught up and never really got out of it until the war stops it from happening. In the 1800s, apologists, people who were for slavery, used historical and religious arguments to support that slavery was good for the slave and master. Just like the Reform movement uses the Bible to justify ending slavery, Southerners will use the Bible to justify keeping slavery. Like there's a lot of passages in the Bible about the role of the slave and the role of the master. It's perverted for this cause, but that's what they use to justify this. Because obviously the Bible also denounces slavery at the same time. They also use historical examples like Roman Empire or other, Greeks or whoever, where slavery is very common. And so there's a lot of people who begin to defend it, write books and write articles defending why slavery is a good thing for Southerners to have. Okay, so we're going to stop there for our video. We'll resume all this on Monday and pick up from that point and wrap all this up. And we'll be ready for our test come Tuesday. So the test should be Tuesday no matter what. Short answer will be Wednesday, and then we'll start Unit 5 shortly after that. So have a good weekend. See you Monday.